administration's effort to continue the New Deal through other means. One of the key ways of doing this was the GI Bill, which is famous for, let's see, here we are, for how it transformed American society. Every person who had served in the military received a set of guaranteed benefits when they left service. They had essentially a year's continuation on military pay, so when they left, so that they would have a transition back to the labor market. They would be able to go to school, not just university, but actually they could go to a trade school, a mechanics school, any kind of school, take classes, and not only would the government pay for their fees, it would give them money to live on while they were getting their education, and they could continue going to school as long as they were working towards some kind of accredited degree. So if you got out of the military in 1945 and you entered as a freshman in a university, you could continue getting paid to go to college until you finished your PhD some 12 years later. The government also provided special housing loans, which allowed veterans to get better terms for buying homes. This was particularly important in terms of the post-war economy because the growth of construction after the end of the war to build homes for returning vets and their new families was what jump-started the economy. And then people in their new homes needed refrigerators, washing machines, and stoves, and so forth. So it generated a consumer durables market that lasted for a long time. The Roosevelt planners wanted the GI Bill actually to be available to anybody who had done war service. So if you had worked in a defense plant, you would be eligible. If you had been in the Merchant Marine, which had the highest casualty rate of anybody during the war, you would be eligible. Critics of the New Deal, long-term critics of the New Deal, were afraid of this kind of expansion of well, we would use the word entitlements now, but of these kinds of grants, and thus fought to restrict the grants only to people who had been in this actual military service. This meant, of course, that women, who had been an important part of wartime employment, were disproportionately unable to get these kinds of benefits except through their husbands. One of the benefits here, this is 47, homesteading veteran. The story behind this is that war veteran Dale Sprout, 23 years old, notice he has 2 children, is one of the winners of the farm lottery that was held last month by the U.S. government at Klamath Falls, Oregon. Homesteader Sprout is shown on Life's cover with his wife Iva and their son and daughter at Tule Lake, while they take their first good look at the land they have won. As a former P-51 pilot in the 15th Air Force, Sprout was eligible for the drawing, which was open only to veterans of World War II. Now Sprout will be settling down near his old home. His parents have a farm at Tule Lake, which he helped work before he went into the Army. Now, if you notice the title up there, Farm Lottery, Veterans at Tule Lake Win Land Developed in Wartime by the Japs. We learn that 86 valuable farm sites ranging in size from 61 to 141 acres of rich bottomland cultivated into fertile farm lots by the Japanese who were interned at the Tule Lake Segregation Center during the war. So these were not Japanese prisoners of war. These were the Japanese-American internees who took this land, developed it into productive farmland, and then the government gave it to, through a lottery to veterans. So the relationship that the nation as a whole had with its citizenry was changing with the various clauses of the GI Bill. Just as the Sprouts used their provision to establish themselves as independent farmers, other provisions allowed other vets to go to college or to auto mechanics school. People were buying homes in record numbers. They were moving out into the world. The numbers of people going to college was dramatically increasing, from a little over 10% in 1940 to over 35% by the early 1950s. And this was all part of a 22-year-long economic boom that started in 1947 and ended in 1969. The activity of the veterans, which was closely dependent upon government assistance, was transformed in this article into a frontier study, a frontier story, presented here simultaneously as individualistic, domestic, and patriarchal, yet collectively based on government aid and resulting ultimately upon a claim for the American nation's rights to the spoils of conquest. This was another couple that won, looking out at the land that they won through the lottery. And Life magazine, after the war, liked to do stories about returning vets. This guy was a cross-country truck driver. There's a way in which these photographs transform them into kind of Hollywood motion picture characters. After the war, advertising, real advertising returns, and people start buying automobiles. Why? Because there was so much money involved. People had, besides the government subsidies that were being given to many people, savings had piled up during the war years, and people had money to make sizable purchases of homes, of cars, of refrigerators. Which in this period then become a normal part of everyday life for the large majority of Americans. Now, the GI Bill, Congress wrote into the GI Bill, fearful that Roosevelt was going to use it, or his people were going to use it for social engineering, that the government could not interfere with normal business practices. What did this mean? The GI Bill loans could not be used to force banks to change their lending practices. So one of the results of the GI Bill is actually an increasing segregation of housing, because banks determined that anybody who would want to live in an integrated neighborhood had to be unstable, their terminology, and therefore they would not provide a loan, even under the terms the quite subsidized terms of the GI Bill. So you could use your GI Bill to buy a home if you were white in a white neighborhood. If you were black in a black neighborhood, you could never use it to buy a home in a neighborhood which was defined as belonging to another race. This in the war that was fought for democracy and for rights and for the end of racism was one of the contradictory conclusions to it. So the new kitchen and at the same time, because people are getting more education and because the society is becoming increasingly service-oriented and increasingly middle class, there were people moving into middle-class jobs who were coming from working-class backgrounds. And one of the things that the magazines had to do was train people how to behave, how to dress, how to wear deodorant, how to iron your clothes, how to eat properly. Do you put your fork on the right side or the left side of the plate? There were actually a whole series of articles as well as advertisements that were intended to train people how to become middle class, properly middle class, or to play on their insecurities that they could not be, that they were frauds. For women, similar kinds of the parallel advertisements had the middle-class woman was the woman who invited romance, kept hold of her husband, and maybe even controlled him. He's helpless in your hands. And of course, a new style of entertainment, because everyone should have a record player, not yet a stereo. And the 40s is also the period in which teenage culture emerges for the first time, as teenagers become a distinct niche market. Now, Life magazine, this is an article, I thought this was amusing. This was actually following the couples who won the lottery in Tule Lake, an article instructing Americans about how French men make love. And if you notice at the bottom, there's the contrast of the American husband who is deemed to be deficient, insufficiently romantic, insufficiently attentive, insufficient in pretty much every way. So, and if you're going to have a companionate marriage of equals, the woman who is supposed to be going back home to take care of the kids should be able to expect some kind of deeper relationship with her husband than do you want gravy on your potatoes or butter. And this, I think, is also another interesting aspect of advertising. Industrial companies start promoting themselves for their roots back into the working class. That these are the top managers of the Bell telephone system, what's now AT&T, and they all started out working in very menial jobs and work their way up, often going to college in the process.